Hey, I'm Alan Spears, and I'm the Director of Cultural Resources for the National Parks and Conservation Association, and I work for 10 Alley.
And I'm the guy who doesn't represent my agency. But I'm Phil Sexton, again, with California State Parks. And since somebody just mentioned the CHL, the California Historic Landmark for the railroad, let me explain a little bit about that. It's an interesting set of markers that goes from Sacramento as far east as Dutch Flat, I believe, and they all have the same historic landmark number. I think it's 773, but it's sequential, so it's 773-1, -2, -3, and so on. So anything that would go up at the pass, I think, would have that same number, and the idea was to represent that linear accomplishment of building the railroad. So it really is a fascinating idea, and I have checked many times, and I've never learned why it stopped at Dutch Flat. But that would be a little complicated process, but much simpler than a National Historic Landmark Designation. The NHL ones are very, very exhaustive, but it's a good springboard to doing that.
Okay. Alan, why don't you start? Give us a little bit of
Sure.
ideas about.
So, you know, John, for me, it's all about politics. And that's what I do at NPCA, and that's what I hope to bring to this particular group. And the funding and the development of Asia Pacific Islander American history and historic sites in Summit Tunnel, it's going to be much more difficult to make that happen if the politics aren't aligned. So I'm happy to hear that you guys will be leaving here promptly at 2 o'clock to head to the Library of Congress and colloquially with Judy Chu, Congresswoman Chu, and some of her colleagues, hopefully. The funding options, I think, and the way that it relates to politics for me, just want to share a couple things with you, really quick in bullet point order. I think there needs to be an understanding, again, that historic preservation does have a political context, and that I think that one of the things that this group needs to concentrate on moving forward is making sure you've got the political alignment and support for what you do at the local, state, and federal level. That's critically important, but also within the preservation community. The Historic Preservation Fund, the underserved or underrepresented communities grant programs, all these things, people are identifying these as potential pots of money. And if you walk in brand new to Capitol Hill and claim that you want $500,000 or $50,000 or something, and you've not yet made the rounds and worked with groups like NPCA, or the Trust for Historic Preservation, or the Wilderness Society, or other groups, you're going to find that there are other people who are like, you know, listen, we've been here for a while and waiting in line, so take your place. So you've got to do some cultivation at a grassroots level, at the local, state, and federal level. That's incredibly important. The Underrepresented Communities Grant Program has an FY 2019 enacted budget of $750,000. That's not a lot. It is an increase, but the recommended level for FY 2020 is to raise it all the way up to $1 million. That's still federal chump change. So there also has to be a bit of activism involved in making sure that you are being stewards for these programs, whether we are doing Antiquities Act defense, whether we want more money for the Historic Preservation Fund, Underserved Communities Grants, African American Civil Rights Grants, the Network to Freedom Program, or even the National Heritage Area Program, which right now is stuck at $20.3 million annually. And we need to prize our funding increase out of Congress for that program as well, especially if we want to add new heritage areas to that component. So again, the politics and making sure you're connected, making sure that the money works. The other part of the funding component is how do you get the message out to the federal land management agencies that you're working on? We've got a bunch of Forest Service folks here. So is Vicki Christensen still the interim chief, or do you guys have a permanent chief at this point?
She is permanent.
She's permanent. Okay, so one agency down. The National Park Service still does not have a confirmed director of the National Park Service. We hope David Bellin will get a confirmation. The timeline on that is sometime between now and the next 2 to 3 months, depending upon how the paperwork goes. But revisiting these agencies with permanent leadership so that they can actually set guidelines and a plan, and making sure that they are aware that this kind of expansion is something that's important to these communities and to all Americans, is something that really is important to get on the radar. And the other thing is as we move forward on this work, be careful about accepting unfunded mandates. You will find right now in Congress, especially a democratically controlled House, that there will be a number of people who might be interested in introducing a Summit Tunnel bill to establish something that's a Forest Service site, or maybe something that's jointly managed between the Forest Service and the Park Service. Where our congressional representatives, and I'm talking about friends of ours, Democrats and Republicans, champions for historic preservation, tend to fall down is understanding that after you designate, you have to fund. And if we designate 5, 10 new sites, new heritage areas, but do not increase funding for these programs, they do not give our colleagues in the Park Service the funding increase that they deserve, and we don't tackle the deferred maintenance issue, then we are essentially creating new sites that can't do anything really but fail. So designation and funding have to be tied together. It's like, left and right hand. And then I think the other part in terms of the funding issue, and I don't have any solutions to this, but it's just something to introduce early in the conversation, is the notion of an endowment. So not only do we want to designate a Summit Tunnel, national, whatever, but we also want to convince the Forest Service, the Park Service, the administration, Department of Interior, Department of Agriculture, that the people in this room have contacts with high-profile donors, whether they're individuals or corporations, that can put $10 million in a fund to establish an endowment so that the week after, I think it was Terry, you mentioned creating the statute that you can't fund after it's designated, they know that there's some money there to help with interpretation, paying salaries, paying interns, covering costs, making sure the fire suppression system is up to date, all those things. So the other thing to think about is an endowment going forward. The last thing that I wanted to share with my time in terms of funding is there's an awful lot of research that needs to be done to make sure that the fundamentals are in place to get the best possible outcomes for preservation purposes. My organization, the National Parks Conservation Association, would be open to partnering with organizations and people in this room to house an intern. If we get going on that process early enough in a year, we might be able to produce some funding that could bring someone in. I know in the past, working with Ted and with Stan, we never quite got there, but there were interns that had their costs covered through an outside organization that could be housed at NPCA. If we are able to do something like that, we could get someone in for 3 months, 6 months, an entire year, especially if their salary is being covered, and I can put them to work in my cultural resources team working on nothing but Summit Tunnel, or working on nothing but Asian Pacific Islander American historic preservation initiatives. So, and that gives them an office. They are in a conservation preservation nonprofit. They're meeting other professionals. They're doing work on Capitol Hill. They're really getting a soup to nuts opportunity to see how this business works. And they are producing product that could go into the production of a Summit Tunnel site. So, again, for me, it's mostly politics. I didn't come with a checkbook. I apologize, but I do work for a nonprofit, so that's the best I can do.